The prosecutor's voice echoed in the sterile wood-paneled courtroom, each word a hammer blow against my career. "The evidence is clear," he declared, his voice ringing with conviction. "The accused, through gross negligence, compromised a standard operating procedure, risking not just a mission, but national security itself." I sat there in my dress uniform, my posture perfect, my face a carefully constructed mask of composure. Inside, I was just tired. The presiding officer, General Thompson, a man with a face like carved granite, looked down at me, and I saw the undisguised disappointment in his eyes. It was a look I was used to. Just as the prosecutor finished, the doors opened. A stoic Air Force courier in ceremonial blues walked with purpose to the general's bench and placed a single black wax-sealed envelope before him. The room fell silent. General Thompson broke the seal, his eyes scanning the single page inside. His entire demeanor shifted. The stern judgment vanished, replaced by a stone-cold shock that tightened his jaw. He slowly raised his gaze, but not to me. His eyes locked onto the key witness for the prosecution, my father, Colonel Jensen. The general's voice was dangerously quiet. "You are still under oath. I suggest you remember that 2 months earlier, the battlefield was a formal retirement dinner. I was there with my father, Colonel Robert Jensen, a man obsessed with the infantry glory of his past and utterly dismissive of my intelligence career. He was holding court, of course, telling war stories to a captivated audience while I faded into the wallpaper. It was a familiar role. When a guest politely asked what I did, I prepared to give my sanitized, vague answer. But before I could speak, my father's heavy hand landed on my shoulder. He let out a booming laugh. "Eva here pushes paper for the Signal Corps," he announced to the table, and specifically to the quiet, unassuming man sitting next to me. "Keeps track of radio parts so the real soldiers can do their jobs, right, honey?" The sting was familiar, the casual dismissal a wound I'd learned to ignore since childhood. This time, however, it was different. The unassuming man was Director Hill, my direct superior from the DIA, a man who read reports I wrote from places my father couldn't even imagine. His face remained neutral, but his eyes met mine for a fraction of a second, and in that glance, I saw everything. The insult wasn't just personal anymore. My father had just proven to the one man who truly knew the stakes that my own family was a security liability. My father thought he was making a harmless joke at my expense. He had no idea he'd just belittled me in front of the one man who had to read my after-action reports from behind enemy lines. To understand the court-martial that followed, you have to understand the 2 lives I was living. My father's pride has always been a performance, and my commissioning ceremony was his grandest stage. I stood there, straight and proud in my new uniform, the crisp fabric a shield against the complex emotions churning inside me. He was beaming, but it wasn't a light that shone on me. It was a spotlight he was aiming back at himself. His speech wasn't about my accomplishment. It was a sprawling monologue about his own legacy, his service, his sacrifices. I was merely the latest chapter in his book, a footnote to his story. Afterward, he pressed a small, cold piece of metal into my palm. "Crossed rifles, his old infantry insignia. This is to remind you what the real army is about," he'd said, his voice full of a meaning that was for him, not for me. When I was assigned to Fort Huachuca for intelligence school, he called it a soft billet, a vacation from the real work. That's when the nickname started. "Scribbles?" He said it with a chuckle the first time, and the rest of the family, eager to follow his lead, adopted it instantly. It became my identity at every holiday dinner, every family gathering. I was Scribbles, the one with the safe, boring desk job. I remember trying just once to explain the intellectual rigor of my work over a crackling phone line. I was talking about geopolitical analysis when he cut me off mid-sentence. "That's great, honey. Hey, did you hear your cousin just qualified expert with his rifle? Now that's a real soldier's skill." The line went quiet as I searched for a response, but there wasn't one. It was just another tally mark on a ledger I never wanted to keep. My other life, my real life, was a universe away from that petty condescension. It existed in places like a nondescript apartment in a hostile European capital, the air smelling of stale cigarettes and ozone from the humming electronics. My face was the only thing illuminated in the darkness, lit by the cold blue glow of an encrypted laptop screen. I wasn't Scribbles here, I was Ariadne, and I was communicating with a high-value asset, a terrified foreign scientist who held the keys to a rogue nuclear program. He was ready to defect, but everything was going wrong. The data was flowing, but my gut was screaming. The asset is confirming the enrichment levels, I said into my nearly invisible comms unit, my voice low and steady. But we have a problem. We need a clean exfil route, but our SIGINT, the eyes and ears listening, from the sky, is showing a Zarya unit sweeping the district. The Zarya unit. They weren't just police, they were butchers and torturers. If they found him, he wouldn't just die, he'd spend weeks wishing he could. We have to abort the primary plan. My handler's voice came back, tinny and distant. Your call, Ariadne. What's the play? There was no time for committee meetings, no time for multi-level approvals. There was only the life of the man on the other end of my screen, and the intel he carried. He was my responsibility. So, I made the call. I initiated an emergency, unsanctioned protocol, a ghost route I had helped design for just such a nightmare scenario. It was a high-wire act with no safety net, a move that broke a dozen minor procedural rules about verification. But it worked. I got him out. I saved his life and secured the intel. In the quiet hum of the apartment, after the connection was severed, I felt the familiar adrenaline ebb away, leaving only a cold, professional satisfaction. I knew I had broken a rule, a small, bureaucratic rule about getting 3 signatures before you act. And I knew, even then, that in my father's world, the rule would matter more than the life I had saved. After the disastrous retirement dinner, I got the expected phone call from my mother, a woman who believed that family peace was worth any price, especially when it was my own. I could hear the sigh in her voice before she even spoke my name. Eva, she started, her tone already pleading. You know how your father is. His service was his whole life. He just doesn't understand your computer work. I listened to her excuses, the same ones I'd been hearing my entire life, the verbal patches she used to cover the holes in our family. It's easier to just let him think what he wants, she concluded, as if it were a profound truth. But it wasn't easier. It was corrosive. It was a lie that I was forced to carry for everyone's comfort but my own. For years I had let them believe their version of my life because it was safer. The secret I was protecting wasn't mine, it was national security. But my father was about to make the gravest mistake of his life. He was going to force my 2 worlds to collide. The betrayal, when it came, wasn't a surprise. Only the sheer scale of it was. My father, hearing a distorted rumor about my procedural error through one of his old Pentagon cronies, saw his chance. This was the proof he'd always been looking for that my quiet, intellectual work was flawed, that I wasn't a real soldier like him. Believing I had dishonored his name, he used every ounce of his considerable influence to have a minor review escalated into a formal inquiry. He wrapped himself in the flag, arguing that standards were slipping and that I needed to be made an example of. The minor infraction was twisted and magnified until it became a full-blown court-martial for dereliction of duty. And then came the final, cruelest cut. He volunteered to testify against me as an expert witness on military protocol. I was in a box, and he knew it. The details of the mission, Operation Albatross, were classified to a level that meant I couldn't breathe a word of the real story without committing treason. I couldn't defend myself. My appointed defense was Lieutenant Miller, a young, overwhelmed lawyer from the JAG Corps who looked at me with sincere, pitying eyes. He advised me to plead guilty and hope for leniency. He saw an unwinnable case. I saw an opportunity. I looked at him, my face calm, and gave him his orders. We're pleading not guilty, Lieutenant, and you are going to file every possible motion for discovery on Operation Albatross. He started to protest, but I cut him off. They will all be denied, that's the point. I need a paper trail of obstruction. My real move, however, was made in silence, far from any courtroom. Using my one remaining sliver of access, I sat down at a secure terminal in a windowless room. My fingers moved deliberately across the keyboard as I composed a single, formal request to a Black-funded oversight committee within the DIA. It was a mechanism so secret, most of the agency didn't know it existed, the Providence Directive. It wasn't a plea for help. It was a deep-state kill switch, an internal audit so profound that it overrode nearly all other classifications. I wasn't reporting that I was in trouble. I was reporting that a highly classified operation was potentially being compromised by an outside actor. My father. I was trusting the system, the cold, impersonal, ruthless system I served, to protect itself. My father was preparing his testimony, polishing his medals, ready to play the part of the disappointed patriarch. He thought he was entering a courtroom. He had no idea he was walking into a damage assessment. The court-martial was in full session at Fort Belvoir, and my father was in his element. He sat on the witness stand, radiating a smug authority that filled the room. His uniform immaculate, his posture a testament to a lifetime of command. He spoke in condescending tones, lecturing the prosecutor and the panel about the fundamentals of command, a topic on which he considered himself the ultimate expert. He painted a masterful picture of me as a reckless, careless analyst, someone with a desk-bound perspective who had forgotten the stakes of the real world, his world. Listening to him, I felt a strange, cold detachment. He used words like honor and duty, the very same words he used to justify 1,000 small cruelties, 1,000 dismissals of my own quiet service. He was performing the role he had cast for himself my entire life, the wise patriarch, the seasoned warrior, correcting his wayward child. He was in the middle of a particularly patronizing anecdote about his time in the field when the proceedings came to a dead stop. The main doors of the courtroom opened, and a silent, stoic Air Force courier entered. The air, which had been thick with my father's self-importance, suddenly crackled with confusion. Every eye followed the courier as he walked to the general's bench and placed a single black envelope before him. My father paused, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face at being interrupted. The prosecutor looked bewildered. Only I knew what was coming. I held my breath, not out of hope, but out of a grim certainty. This was the point of no return. General Thompson, his face an unreadable mask of stone, broke the wax seal with a deliberate crack that echoed in the silent room. His eyes scanned the single page within, and I watched the subtle, yet seismic transformation. The stern judgment in his gaze dissolved, replaced by something harder, colder. He slowly folded the paper and stood, his presence seeming to suck all the air out of the room. "This court," he announced, his voice resonating with a new, chilling authority, "is now in receipt of a finding from the Director of National Intelligence." He let that title hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "The final after-action report for Operation Albatross has been declassified for this council's review." He looked directly at me, and for the first time I saw not disappointment, but a profound understanding. On the date in question, Captain Rostova, operating under the clandestine callsign Ariadne, made a command decision that resulted in the successful exfiltration of a strategic-level asset. Ariadne. The name dropped into the room like a stone. I saw the confusion on my father's face. He'd never heard that name. It was from my other life, the one where I wasn't Scribbles. The general paused, letting the weight of the moment settle before turning his gaze, like a weapon, onto my father. The report states, and I quote, his voice was precise, cutting, "Captain Rostova's deviation from protocol was not an error, but a necessary and authorized execution of Emergency Infiltration Protocol 7. He let the words hang in the air for a beat, which she herself helped write. The checkmate. The final, undeniable truth. My father, the expert on protocol, had just been told that he was trying to condemn the very architect of the rule in question. But the general wasn't finished. His voice dropped even lower, becoming as sharp and cold as iron. This report also includes a finding from the Inspector General. He was no longer reading, he was passing sentence. It concerns an attempt by an external party, Colonel Robert Jensen, to use unlawful command influence to initiate this trial and to tamper with a witness, namely himself. He stared down at the man in the witness box. By providing testimony that was, in the IG's words, knowingly incomplete and maliciously framed. I watched my father's face, the smugness, the authority, the righteous anger, it all just evaporated. The color drained from his skin, leaving a pasty gray pallor. He seemed to shrink in his chair, the crisp uniform suddenly looking like a hollow costume. His entire world, the carefully constructed legacy he had worshipped his entire life, was being dismantled before a live audience. General Thompson looked down at him, not with anger, but with a kind of profound, weary contempt. "Colonel, your testimony has been struck. Your legacy of service is now under formal review. My father had spent my entire life lecturing me on the chain of command. In the end, it only took a single paragraph from someone higher up his old chain to end his career for a second time." General Thompson's voice rang out with two final words. With prejudice. The gavel fell with a crack that seemed to break the tension that had held the room captive. It was over. As the court adjourned, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the observers. I remained seated, watching as two stern-faced military police officers approached the witness stand. My father was still sitting there, a collapsed figure in a pristine uniform, the smug authority he'd worn like armor, now shattered into a million pieces. He looked old and small. They were his escort to the Inspector General's office, the beginning of his own formal reckoning. He didn't look at me as they led him away. He couldn't. I felt a presence beside me, and turned to see Director Hill. He had been sitting in the back of the courtroom the entire time, a silent observer from my real world. He said nothing, but words weren't necessary. He simply placed a new assignment folder in my hands. It felt heavy, important. He gave me a single, firm nod of absolute respect, a gesture that meant more than any medal or citation. It was an acknowledgement, a welcome home. A few of my other colleagues approached then, their faces a mixture of relief and a new profound awe. There were no grand speeches, just quiet handshakes and claps on the shoulder. I was no longer an accused officer. I was one of them again, fully and completely. 1 year later, the air in the secure briefing room deep inside the Pentagon was cool and smelled faintly of ozone and sterilized air. I stood at the head of a long table, a major's gold oak leaves gleaming on my uniform. My nameplate read simply, Major E. Rostova, OIC Task Force Aegis. This was my team, my real family, a collection of the sharpest minds in the agency, people bound not by blood or obligation, but by a shared mission and a quiet, profound competence. There was no need for performance here, no need to manage fragile egos. There was only the work, the intricate, high-stakes puzzle of protecting national interests. We trusted each other with our lives daily, a bond my father, with all his lectures on loyalty, could never comprehend. The final report from the Inspector General's investigation had been brutally concise. I read it on a secure network months after the trial. The findings were stark. Colonel Rhett Robert Jensen was found guilty of unlawful command, influence, and perjury. The consequences were not emotional, but procedural, the only language the system truly speaks. He was formally censured, and his security clearance was permanently and irrevocably revoked. That last part was the deepest cut. It barred him from all military installations, from the world that had been his entire identity. He was, in the end, an outsider, locked out of the very institution he tried to weaponize for his own ego. I was in my new office, a quiet space with a view of the river, reviewing satellite intel for an upcoming operation. An email notification popped up, a ghost from another life. The subject line was just 2 words, "Your father." It was from my mother. The message was a short, rambling, disjointed plea for me to call, filled with phrases like "he made a mistake and he's not well." I read the words, and I waited for the familiar sting of anger, the heavy weight of sorrow, or even the bitter taste of triumph. But I felt nothing. The space he had once occupied in my soul, the part of me that had endlessly craved his approval, was simply quiet. The ledger was closed. I highlighted the message, my finger hovering over the screen for a moment before I clicked Archive. I didn't reply. I didn't get angry. I turned my full attention back to the tactical map on my screen, zooming in on the mission ahead. My focus was on the future. My father believed a legacy was something you pass down. I learned it's something you earn in the shadows and have validated by the truth. If you've ever had to fight a battle no one else could see, share your story below. In this community, your report is always trusted.